All right, so continuing Chapter 9, Key Issue 3, we're going to talk about alternative energy sources. So we talked about fossil fuel demand and supply, and I want to go into some of the negative effects of fossil fuels, but we'll talk about those in class. So what are some alternative energy sources that we could use instead? Because we know that fossil fuels can increase the overall warming of the Earth's atmosphere, surface waters, and land, which can lead to climate change, so changing overall climatic trends. Burning coal can lead to acid rain. Burning natural gases and oils, particularly oil, can lead to higher rates of tropospheric ozone. It can lead to photochemical smog, which are bad. They can contribute to respiratory problems. And so how do we prevent these things? We got to burn less fossil fuels. We know that the supply and demand, we unequally use the world's fossil fuel resources, and they're unequally distributed, and that the price of something like oil isn't even controlled by the country that's mining it or that's drilling for it, or, right now it can be controlled by an organization of oil producing countries. And so we don't even always have control of the price of oil or how much of the oil that's already been drilled for and processed, how much of it's available for sale. So what kind of alternative energy sources? One, non-renewable alternative energy sources. Alternative energy means just not fossil fuels. So nuclear energy is an alternative energy source, but it's non-renewable. Nuclear energy is electricity that's produced by splitting uranium atoms in a controlled environment. And when you split an atom, it's called fission. Nuclear energy produces radioactive waste, and radioactive waste is dangerous, right, for humans. It causes mutations, radiation poisoning for 10 half-lives. And so really, in order to store most radioactive waste safely, you need to find a place to store it for 100,000 years. Imagine how hard it would be for a government to plan somewhere that would be safe for 100,000 years. That's the biggest problem. The other problem is that nuclear waste and the nuclear material for energy can be used to make a nuclear bomb. And even lightly radioactive waste, like the fuel rods used in a nuclear power plant, not even the radioactive material, that can be used in what's called a dirty bomb. That's just a regular bomb with radioactive material in it. So not only can you build like a nuclear bomb, right, like we use in Nagasaki or Hiroshima, you can just throw in some radioactive material into a regular bomb, and it still, spreads radiation through the area where you set it off. So radioactive material is dangerous both for our physical health, but it's also a national security risk for any country that's using it. Nuclear energy supplies about 14% of the world's electricity. But it's used by only about 30 of the world's 200 countries. So it's used by 19 developed countries and 11 developing countries. 2/3 of the world's nuclear power is generated in North America and Europe. Most highly dependent countries are kind of clustered in Europe. And we have a higher concentration of nuclear power plants in the eastern half of the United States. And we haven't built many new ones. It's expensive to build a nuclear power plant, and they're very highly regulated. So many people don't really want to. So you see that France has a lot of nuclear energy, more than the United States does. But Europe has a lot, the United States, Canada, Russia, and there is some nuclear energy plants in India, Pakistan, China, Brazil. So if you see here in the United States, most of our nuclear power plants are in the northeastern part. We have 2 in South Florida. We have some just north of us as well, just north of Lake Okeechobee, close to like the Space Coast area, and 1 out here in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have 5 in Florida, 2 that are very close to us, 1 that was leaking slightly radioactive material into its outdoor cooling pond just a few years ago, Turkey Lake. There's several in California, which is a little concerning because the number of earthquakes they have there. And lots in Illinois as well. The ones that are black dots are the ones that are closed. Radioactive waste is lethal to humans, and you can't treat the waste to make it safe. So you have to keep it away from people for, like 100,000 years. Uranium, which is the fuel source we use, is non-renewable. So we only have like 124 years of uranium that we know of in the planet. And that's at our current consumption rate, which is just 14% of the world's energy supply. So when you look at not alternative energies like nuclear energy, using more of it would reduce our fossil fuel consumption, so it would reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, so it would help with climate change. But as far as like, do we have enough? Not really. We don't have very much. And if you increase the amount of energy we are using it for, we would have less. So if we started to use nuclear energy for 20%, that would probably drop it down to a 100-year supply. If we jumped it up to 50%, you're looking at like a 60-year supply of nuclear energy. Nuclear power plants cost billions of dollars to build. And again, like, we don't even know where we're going to put the radioactive waste in the United States. We have facilities to store material that's considered like slightly radioactive. Again, that's like machinery that's been used in it, or like aprons, like tongs, like the clothing that you wear, safety goggles. So things that are like that clock in as radioactive but aren't actually radioactive material. And then you have your actual radioactive waste, like your spent cores and your uranium. Once it's been split, it's no longer uranium, but it's still radioactive. And so we don't know where we're putting it. We have temporary storage sites. There's a place called Yucca Mountain that we've talked about storing it, and it's on again, off again for years. Nobody wants to store nuclear waste near them. It's part of the problem. So nuclear waste doesn't really solve all of our problems. Also, because you have to mine for uranium, when we talk about mining later in the year, every single problem we have with mining, you would have with getting nuclear energy sources as well. So uranium has to be mined, and so every single problem with mining, like deforestation, erosion, contamination of groundwater, all of those things happen with nuclear energy too, except that it not only is the waste toxic, but it causes radiation poisoning for 100,000 years. So it's like mining, but usually worse. So the other type of alternative energy is renewable energy. So we're going to go over the different types, and we'll go over like how that energy works in class. And we'll spend a little time building some alternative energy sources in class. So we have hydroelectric power. Hydroelectric power uses moving water, and this is really important, moving water. Moving water spins something called a turbine, and the turbine powers a generator. A generator has magnets, and these magnets, as they spin, they move electrons. It's the movement of electrons that makes electricity. That's why it's electricity, right? Electrons, electricity. So the moving of these giant, powerful magnets in a generator, it's like a motor. So now you're starting to move electrons through, and that is generating electricity. It is the leading source of renewable energy, both in developed and developing regions. And I saw lots of hydroelectric power when I was in Iceland, when I was in France, when I was in Ecuador, when I was in Costa Rica. It is the second most popular source of electricity after coal. One of the problems with hydroelectric energy is that you have to build a dam. We don't have a lot of hydroelectric power used in the United States. In areas where you have water that's already like flowing down, we have some power. We have some areas, and areas where we've already built like giant dams, like the Hoover Dam, we have hydroelectric power. But we know there's a lot of environmental challenges with building a dam, so unless you have the environmental conditions that are right for it, hydroelectric power isn't always the best option for a region. Another type of renewable energy is biomass, and biomass is just burning fuel. So biomass includes like burning wood for energy. In many developing countries, most people use wood to fuel their cooking stoves, which causes a lot of indoor air pollution, right? So you're breathing in that smoke, and that can cause respiratory problems. So burning wood or crops can be used to generate heat for cooking, and you can also use it to generate electricity. In the United States and many developing countries, we use things like sugarcane, corn, and soybeans, and we use that to make ethanol, which is added to our gasoline. So if you go to the gas station, you're using a lot of ethanol in your car. You're using less fossil fuels because we're also running on ethanol. Some problems with it is that burning biomass might require a lot of energy to produce the crop. So in order to make the crops, to make ethanol, we had to use water, we had to use irrigation, we had to use tractors, right, to plow the land, and those tractors usually run on fossil fuels. We use fertilizers, and fertilizers use fossil fuels to produce, and then we transported them in trucks that probably use fossil fuels on roads that were built from asphalt, which is made from petroleum, so more fossil fuels. So making biomass requires a lot of energy. It also means that sometimes we're putting food that people could eat in countries where malnutrition is a big deal, and we're using it for fuel. So instead of using the excess corn for fuel, we could be, giving it to countries and areas that, are suffering from malnutrition. And of course, logging trees for wood to be burned can reduce the overall fertility of a forest. So if people are over-reliant on biomass, they might increase their deforestation of an area. There's also wind energy. Wind energy has minimal impacts on the environment. We really should be using it more. Even if you live in an area that's not windy all the time, you could have wind turbines set up and they could harness the wind when they could. Many people have concerns about windmills being too noisy, so that not in my backyard. You don't think they're loud or unattractive. Windmills or wind turbines really can be lethal for birds and bats. When they migrate, they can hit the blades. An easier solution is to track migration patterns of these birds and build the turbines not in an annual migration pattern. And migration patterns change, and so that's complex. That can't always be solved. But even putting things like maybe LED lights on them would keep them away. Like there's challenges, but overall wind energy is pretty good for the environment. Some people think they are unattractive. I think they're beautiful. Like I drove through Indiana and they have wind turbines in most of their cornfields, and I thought it was very attractive. Other things that people don't like is you do have to build it. So like there is other energy requirements. Like to build a wind turbine, you have to build the parts and ship them. And of course, you have to have energy, you have to have wind blowing to generate the electricity. But overall, wind is pretty solid choice, and setting up wind turbines, even in areas that don't have a huge amount of wind power, is better than nothing. In this area here with the Gulf Stream, you could actually use something like a wind turbine, but upside down in the water with a cage around it so like dolphins don't swim into it. And that can generate electricity the same way. And you're generating electricity because the turbine is moving, and as the turbine moves, it moves the generator, it moves these giant magnets, and it moves electrons. And then we have solar energy, and there's two kinds of solar energy: passive solar energy and active solar energy. Passive solar energy is when you have your windows facing south so the house gets warmer. You paint something black so it absorbs more heat from the sun, but you don't use anything special. Active solar systems collect solar energy and they convert it either into heat, and then the steam powers a turbine which moves a generator, or you convert it to electricity directly, and we'll look at solar panels in class and talk about it a bit more there.